What happens to an economic union when the ocean rises at the same speed everywhere but the walls to keep it out can only be bought by one player? The title card sets the stage for a crisis that is hitting Southeast Asia with perfect geometric indifference. The water does not care about national borders, gross domestic product growth rates, or historical emissions. Yet, as the tide creeps higher from the Java Sea to the Singapore Strait, a stark divergence is taking place. This is not an environmental crisis in the abstract. It is a balance sheet crisis, where sovereign credit ratings and fiscal space now determine whether entire communities survive. Axit 1. The fiscal chasm on the water's edge. To understand how deep this chasm goes, we have to look past the macroeconomics and step onto the coast itself. When you step off the boat into the Muara Angke neighborhood of North Jakarta, the abstraction disappears. This is where the regional reality of climate adaptation hits the ground. It is a place where national policy choices become immediate human battles against the tide. But the real scale of this crisis is best understood through a single home. This is where we meet Astati, a 40-year-old mussel farmer living on the water's edge. She walks across a floor she has personally raised using hundreds of kilograms of green mussel shells. The shells are a cheap, makeshift barrier against the daily tidal floods that seep into her home. She pays local workers 30,000 Indonesian rupiah, roughly $2 a day to shuck her catch, while keeping a watchful eye on a neighborhood WhatsApp group for storm surge warnings. For Astati, there is no high ground to retreat to. The ocean is a shared geographic hazard across this region, but that shared hazard is colliding with a massive structural divide. Can a shared threat break the economic cohesion of a regional bloc? The structural divide in coastal defense across the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is fundamentally a story of sovereign wealth. This is the sovereign wealth gap of climate transition, the distance between what rich states can spend on survival and what poorer neighbors can afford. This is what financial polarization looks like in practice. On one side stands Singapore, wielding its top-tier AAA credit rating and massive financial reserves to fund a century-long 100 billion Singapore dollar fortress strategy. On the other side lie its largest neighbors, hamstrung by tight fiscal constraints, high public debt levels, and lower sovereign credit scores. While Singapore treats climate adaptation as a well-funded national security priority, countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam must treat it as a series of expensive trade-offs. Let us look at how that sovereign wealth becomes physical protection. Singapore's Prime Minister topped up the National Coastal and Flood Protection Fund with an additional 5 billion Singapore dollars. That brought the baseline fund to 10 billion Singapore dollars. This is just the opening move in a multi-decade containment program. The state has the liquidity to act before the crisis peaks. The numbers explain why the spending is non-negotiable. The state declared years ago that climate defenses are just as existential as military defense, forcing all other fiscal priorities to bend to this reality. National Climate Studies project that mean sea levels around the island could rise by over 1 meter by the turn of the century and up to 2 meters by the middle of the next. Because nearly 30% of the island sits less than 5 meters above the current sea level, retreat is not a policy option. Every square meter must be held. Across the regional shipping lanes, the response looks entirely different. Indonesia, facing a 30 million person megacity actively sinking under the weight of its own groundwater extraction, chose to build a brand new capital city in the jungles of Borneo rather than pouring tens of billions of dollars into a permanent wall to contain the Java Sea. That is not engineering. That is administrative retreat. It leaves millions of coastal residents behind on land projected to be underwater within decades, showing how national wealth decides which coastlines get saved and which are left to the rising tide. But understanding the gap requires following the money all the way to the seawall. Axit 2, the engineering of an island fortress. Singapore's wealth translates into physical protection through specific, world-class engineering choices. Its limited land area means every hectare gained from the sea must be defended forever. To accomplish this, the state turned to advanced water management techniques engineered specifically for tropical conditions, adapting Dutch Polder methods to handle monsoon downpours. Every hectare reclaimed from the sea must be defended forever. That requirement forced the first-of-its-kind application of Polder technology under extreme tropical rain conditions. Traditional reclamation relies heavily on massive sand infill, but the Polder approach fundamentally changes the resource math. It builds a protective ring, allowing the land inside to sit below sea level, shielded by a continuous coastal barrier. The prime testing ground for this strategy is a low-lying island called Pulau Tekong. Engineers completed the main construction by the end of 2024 and fully commissioned the site, adding about 800 hectares of new land to the national inventory. This land will ultimately house military training facilities, relieving pressure on the mainland and reducing the need to import sand from neighbors who have placed increasingly strict export bans. Rather than using traditional methods, engineers built a massive 10-kilometer coastal dike that stands 6 meters above mean sea level. Managing tropical downpours inside a giant bowl requires serious infrastructure. The system relies on drainage canals, multiple inlet gates, and a sprawling 116-hectare stormwater collection pond capable of holding 5 million cubic meters of runoff. Dual high-capacity pumping stations then mechanically push the water out into the sea. By using this method, the state cut its requirement for imported sand by nearly half, which matters enormously given that Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam have all restricted sand exports in recent years. The fortress strategy is actively expanding. Feasibility studies are underway for a massive project known as Long Island, which aims to reclaim another 800 hectares of the urbanized East Coast. This project creates a protective barrier that doubles as a freshwater reservoir, storing enough capacity to meaningfully reduce the island's dependence on imported water during droughts. For a city of nearly 6 million people sitting in a region where extreme weather events are intensifying, that reservoir is a strategic buffer. To fund these multi-decade projects without draining its immediate reserves, the state relies on a specific financial toolkit. Under the Significant Infrastructure Government Loan Act, Singapore can borrow up to $90 billion for long-term projects. Backed by its stellar credit rating, the government has already issued billions in 30-year and 50-year sovereign green bonds, locking in ultra-low borrowing costs. XCT3, the arithmetic of urban abandonment. When we turn to Jakarta, the arithmetic shifts from long-term financing to immediate crisis management. Jakarta shows what happens when a country cannot out-engineer nature. The crisis is accelerated by severe land subsidence. Millions of residents lack access to piped surface water, forcing them to pump groundwater from deep aquifers, which compacts the underlying clay. The infrastructure simply cannot keep pace with the physical collapse of the soil. Northern districts of Jakarta have dropped by up to 2.5 meters over the last decade, with local sinking rates hitting nearly 5 centimeters every year. This vertical land movement outpaces global sea level rise by a factor of 10. For the 30 million people who live in this megacity, that is not a projection. Flooding is already a permanent feature of daily life. The infrastructure meant to halt this sinking has fallen apart. A coastal wall built over 2 decades ago collapsed during major floods, forcing local communities to raise their own roads using construction rubble. Meanwhile, the Grand National Fix, a $40 billion offshore seawall shaped like a mythical bird, sits completely stalled due to funding shortfalls, political disputes, and environmental lawsuits. Instead, the state's focus has shifted to Nusantara, the new capital city inaugurated in August 2024. The relocation project carries a price tag of between $30 billion and $33 billion. Private sector interest collapsed, forcing the government to cover 85% of the bill itself. Moving tens of thousands of civil servants to a new jungle capital absorbs the exact fiscal resources needed to fix the crumbling infrastructure of the old one, leaving millions of coastal citizens behind. Exit 4. Delayed canals and the saltwater squeeze. This same fiscal gridlock is playing out in the low-lying delta of the Chao Phraya River, where Bangkok sits just 1.5 meters above the waves. This is a city facing a triple threat: rising tides in the Gulf, heavy monsoonal rain, and massive river runoff from northern provinces arriving simultaneously. Relative water levels are rising rapidly, creating an unprecedented challenge for the urban core. Rising Gulf tides see relative water levels climbing 32 millimeters per year. Heavy monsoon rain from seasonal storms adds a second pressure. River runoff from northern provinces delivers the third. The combined result is serious, with models projecting that central Bangkok's flood zone will expand by over 20% by the turn of the century. The economic stakes are not theoretical. The devastating 2011 floods caused $46.5 billion in economic damage and wiped out over 12% of national output in a single season. The manufacturing sector has never forgotten. Supply chain managers across the electronics and automotive industries still model Bangkok flood risk into their contingency planning. In response, irrigation officials designed an ambitious 9-part water management program valued at $9.4 billion, aimed at doubling the drainage capacity of the lower basin. But execution has ground to a halt. The country's public debt to gross domestic product ratio climbed past 65%, dangerously close to its legal ceiling of 70%. Breaching that ceiling would trigger automatic spending cuts and raise borrowing costs across the entire economy. For the factory worker in the industrial estates north of Bangkok, that is not a fiscal abstraction. It is the difference between a functioning drainage canal and another flooded production floor. Fearing a sovereign credit rating downgrade that would spike borrowing costs, The government delayed the project. They are instead negotiating with the World Bank for partial co-financing to upgrade a fraction of its drainage canals. This leaves critical global electronics and automotive supply chains highly exposed to the next major monsoon, meaning factory shutdowns that delay shipments worldwide. Further east, in the Mekong Delta, the water crisis takes a different form. The delta is home to 18 million people and supplies over 50% of Vietnam's domestic rice, accounting for 90% of its exports. In early 2025, Vietnam became the world's second largest rice exporter, sending nearly 8 million tons abroad annually. But absolute sea level rise and upstream dams have weakened the delta's natural flow, allowing saltwater to travel up to 100 kilometers inland during the dry season, killing crops. Faced with dying crops, local farmers are abandoning rice entirely, converting their freshwater paddies into brackish shrimp ponds for short-term profit. While shrimp farming offers high immediate gains, it carries severe long-term costs. It damages local mangrove networks, accelerates land sinking via increased groundwater use, and reduces regional food export capacity, creating inflationary pressure for grain importing neighbors across the region. But the tools to manage this transition do exist. In the Vietnamese Delta, farmers have successfully piloted dual-use paddies that switch between rice and aquaculture depending on seasonal salinity levels, stabilizing both incomes and land use. Meanwhile, Bangkok's limited canal upgrades have kept the city's flood risk from accelerating as fast as the models predicted. The constraint is not engineering or technology, it is fiscal headroom. Exit 5. The institutional vacuum of a sinking region. This brings us to the core regional problem. The widening adaptation gap reveals a deeper structural flaw, one baked into the very design of regional governance. The bloc that should be coordinating a shared response is structurally prevented from doing so. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations operates under a strict diplomatic model that prioritizes absolute national sovereignty and consensus-based non-interference. No member can compel another to act on climate. There is no central adaptation fund, no shared engineering pool, and no mechanism to transfer capital from wealthy centers to vulnerable deltas. Working groups meet regularly, but mandates are limited to voluntary information sharing and non-binding strategy papers. If this institutional gridlock continues, the consequences are concrete. Frequent flooding in the Chao Phraya watershed could repeatedly halt global manufacturing corridors. Permanent land loss in North Jakarta could displace millions, forcing an influx of internal refugees into unprepared secondary cities. The steady decline of rice production in the Mekong Delta could trigger severe food price shocks across import-dependent nations like the Philippines. Individual island fortresses may hold, but they cannot survive the collapse of the regional system around them. An optimistic path remains possible if regional policy shifts. The advanced Polder and surge barrier technologies built by wealthy states could be licensed and exported as regional public goods rather than proprietary corporate assets. Multilateral climate finance tools could scale up to insulate developing sovereigns from credit downgrades when funding protective infrastructure. Coordinated frameworks could stabilize agricultural output and mitigate uncoordinated migration. The wealthiest corners of the region are successfully building walls, and their deep financial reserves guarantee that those walls will stand. But a regional economic union cannot survive on isolated fortresses alone. The true question facing the coastlines of Southeast Asia is who will pay for the walls that do not get built, and where millions of people will go when the water finally comes. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.